Hello, I'm doing a movie review, and the movie I want to review is Batman the Killing Joke. Now, The Killing Joke is a 2016 animated film, and this is based on the 1988 Batman graphic novel of the same name, which was written by Alan Moore and illustrated by Brian Boland. Now, the graphic novel The Killing Joke is arguably one of the greatest Batman comics ever written. Like, it's considered to be one of the best Batman stories of all time, and it's written by Alan Moore, who is pretty much considered to be the Shakespeare of comics. Like, Alan Moore is not just one of the greatest comic book writers of all time, but honestly, in my opinion, he's one of the great writers of our time. Now, I'm a huge fan of the graphic novel The Killing Joke, so when I heard that they were doing an animated film based on that book, I got genuinely excited, and honestly, this was my most anticipated Batman movie for 2016. And 2016 was a pretty big year for Batman, because you had two live-action Batman movies come out in 2016. Batman vs. Superman and Suicide Squad, but honestly, the Batman movie that I was really excited for was this movie, and unfortunately, this film was kind of a disappointment. And this movie honestly should have been good, because it's based on a phenomenal graphic novel, and also the screenplay for this movie was written by Brian Azzarello, who I actually think is a really good writer. Now, Brian Azzarello also wrote a graphic novel called Joker, which I would honestly rank right up there with The Killing Joke as one of the best Joker stories ever written. And for the most part, I actually think DC has been doing a really good job with these animated films that they've been putting out. Like, they also did the adaptation of Frank Miller's The Dark Knight Returns, which was in 2 parts, and that was freaking phenomenal. So, this really should have been a win-win, but somehow this film turned out to be a complete mess. Now, to a certain extent, I can understand why some of the problems that this movie has came about, because the original graphic novel that this film is based on is actually a relatively short book, and the parts of this movie that are actually adapting The Killing Joke really only take up like 40 minutes of this movie. So really, if they were adapting the book The Killing Joke 100%, the movie would have ended up being like maybe only 40 minutes long. So I understand why they added stuff into this. The problem is, the stuff that they added really doesn't add up with the Killing Joke storyline. Like, really, this film feels like 2 movies in one, and they don't really connect to each other at all. Like, the first half hour of this movie is completely original content for this movie that was not taken from the graphic novel at all, and the first, like, half hour of this movie is so radically different from the rest of the film that it really feels like 2 different movies in one, and that's the biggest problem with this film, is it's paced so poorly, and once again, it just feels like 2 different films in one. Like, even when I was watching this, I kept thinking to myself, is this going to become The Killing Joke at some point, or did I accidentally get a different Batman movie? Now, the basic plotline of this movie, or at least the plotline of the parts of this movie that are actually adapting The Killing Joke, is the Joker escapes from Arkham Asylum, and basically the Joker is trying to prove a point. Basically, the Joker's point is that all it takes is one bad day to set a seemingly normal person over the edge, and the Joker's trying to prove that humanity is inherently insane, and all it takes is one bad day to set a person over the edge. So in the film, the Joker Joker kidnaps Commissioner Gordon and psychologically tortures him, trying to get Commissioner Gordon to go insane. So Batman has to stop the Joker, but throughout the movie, or throughout the original story, Batman is constantly questioning why the Joker does what he does, and essentially the whole point of the original graphic novel was that on a philosophical level, Batman and the Joker are really just two sides of the same coin, and really they're both tragic characters, and they both had a tragic experience in the past that shaped them and made them what they are now. And what Alan Moore was trying to say with the original graphic novel was that Batman and the Joker really aren't too different from each other. Now, that was the plot of the graphic novel, and for the most part, the parts of this movie that follow the graphic novel follow that pretty closely. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends on how you look at it, they added a lot of stuff that wasn't in the graphic novel. Now, something that the Joker does in the graphic novel is he actually shoots Barbara Gordon, and he shoots her in the spine, and this paralyzes her, and this actually leads to her becoming the character of Oracle in later Batman comics, but that was a major thing that happened in the graphic novel. So in this movie, because you had that whole deal of Barbara Gordon getting paralyzed, I guess what they wanted to do was they wanted to flesh her character out a little bit more and show you scenes of her as Batgirl, which to an extent is understandable because maybe somebody watching this movie unfamiliar with the comics might not realize that Barbara Gordon is Batgirl. Obviously, people reading the graphic novel are probably people who have already followed the comics up until that point, but somebody watching the movie for the first time might not really realize who Barbara Gordon is, and they might not really realize the significance of her getting paralyzed, which in the comics, that was a major thing when Alan Moore did that. But for somebody who doesn't really follow the comics, I can understand why they did that, why they showed you scenes of her as Batgirl to really kind of develop her character a little bit more. The problem is, though, they really don't develop her character very well, and the parts of this movie that show you Barbara Gordon as Batgirl really aren't very well written, and I've heard a lot of people say that they thought Batgirl's portrayal in this movie was very sexist. I don't personally think it was intentionally sexist, but I can definitely see where that criticism comes from. Because in the first half hour of this movie where they show you Batgirl, it's clear that Batgirl, or Barbara Gordon, has the hots for Batman, and it kind of gives you the whole idea that the only reason Barbara Gordon even became Batgirl was because she wanted to bang Bruce Wayne, or I don't even know if she knows that Bruce Wayne is Batman at this point, but she wanted to bang Batman. At least that's the impression they give you from the first half hour of this movie. Now, I am aware that in other comics, and even at some point in the animated series, Batman and Barbara Gordon do eventually get together for a brief period of time, so that is something that was taken from other Batman properties, but the problem with it in here is it's not developed enough, and it's not well written enough, and even though I don't personally think it was intentionally sexist, I can see where that comes from. And I think the biggest problem is the first half hour of this movie really does feel like a completely different movie, and it feels like they took one movie and attached it to another movie, and the first half hour of this movie where they show you Barbara Gordon as Batgirl really doesn't tie in very well with the Killing Joke segment of the movie. Like, if they tied it in better, maybe it would have worked better, but it feels like two completely different movies that were just snapped together. And overall, the movie just doesn't work, in my opinion. I mean, the parts of this movie that adapt the Killing Joke are pretty good, but for some reason I feel like there's something watered down about it, like it doesn't have the same punch that the original graphic novel had. Now, obviously, in order to get a feature-length movie, they had to expand on certain things from the original comic, but in my opinion, what they really should have expanded was maybe the flashback sequences that the Joker has in this movie, where the Joker has flashbacks to his normal life. Of course, it's debatable whether that's actually his backstory or not, because the Joker even says that if he were to have a backstory, he would prefer it to be multiple choice. So the Joker really doesn't know his own origin, and he just kind of makes shit up about where he may have came from. But in the parts of this movie which may or may not be the Joker's backstory, which were taken from the comics, I feel like they should have expanded on those more in order to make this movie longer. Now, in the movie, Mark Hamill plays the voice of the Joker. Now, Mark Hamill played the voice of the Joker in Batman the Animated Series. Kevin Conroy in this movie also plays the voice of Batman, and he, of course, played the voice of Batman in Batman the Animated Series as well. Now, obviously, this movie is not set in the same continuity as Batman the Animated Series, but in this film, Kevin Conroy and Mark Hamill both reprised their roles as Batman and the Joker. So, Batman the Killing Joke, it's not a very good movie. The movie's kind of a mess, and the movie's paced horribly, and it's really disappointing to say that because, once again, I'm a huge fan of the book that this movie is based on, but overall, this film is not a very good adaptation. Really, what they should have done with this was they should have just made it like a 40-minute long short film or something. Like, they probably shouldn't have made it a feature-length movie if they had to add all that stuff in. I mean, adding stuff in could have worked, it's just, it wasn't done well. It wasn't very well written, which is surprising because Brian Azzarello, who wrote the screenplay for this, I do think is a really good writer, but overall, it's not a very good film, so I mean, I recommend checking it out of curiosity, but it's not, in my opinion, this is definitely one of my least favorite of the DC animated films that DC has been putting out recently. But yeah, that was my review on The Killing Joke, and bye.